Welcome everybody to this Baker Nord Center Digital Humanities event. As John said, I'm William Deal. I'm an associate director and I work especially on digital humanities here. And it is my very great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Martha Nell Smith is Distinguished Scholar Teacher and Professor of English at the University of Maryland. Dr. Smith is a renowned Emily Dickinson scholar. Her numerous print publications include the books Emily Dickinson, A User's Guide, A Companion to Emily Dickinson, and her award-winning first book, Rowing in Eden, Rereading Emily Dickinson, among other publications. She's also the author of numerous articles and essays in leading academic journals. For our purposes here, especially, in addition to Dr. Smith's traditional print scholarship, she is a pioneer in the digital humanities. She is founding director of the Maryland Institute for Technology in the Humanities, known as MITH, a leading global center for the digital humanities. Among many notable achievements in digital scholarship, Dr. Smith is coordinator and executive editor of the Dickinson Electronic Archives projects at the Institute for Advanced Technology in the Humanities at the University of Virginia. And she has co-edited Emily Dickinson's correspondence, A Born Digital Textual Inquiry. Dr. Smith serves on the advisory board of Harvard University Press's Emily Dickinson Archive and is a recipient of numerous awards from such organizations as the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Mellon Foundation. Her presentation today is titled Time for a Thaw, Visibility, Exclusion, and Futures of Digital Humanities. Please welcome Dr. Martha Nell Smith.
Thank you. First, I want to thank my host. I want to thank John Orlock for being a gracious host. I want to thank Bill Deal for inviting me, and to Lee Zickel for inviting me for the project management workshop. And thanks, by the way, to Maggie, who handled all of the arrangements and made my travel, etc., a lot easier. And I believe, if rumors are true, I should also thank Kate Dunning for nominating me for this talk. You can correct me if I'm wrong later. But now, I'll begin by saying you might wonder where my title comes from, Frozen Social Relations, or Time for a Thaw, Frozen Social Relations, Visibility, Exclusion, and Digital Humanities. Frozen Social Relations comes from Donna Haraway, who has used that very effectively. And I started thinking about this a long time ago when I first started the Dickinson Electronic Archives, so it's 20 years old. And the very first humanities computing, that's what we called it then, conference that I attended, and I was invited to speak, was at Oxford, over in England. And at the banquet afterwards, the host said he wanted to sit by me, and I, of course, wanted to sit by him. And he turned to me about, maybe halfway through the first glass of wine, and he said, "Aren't you glad to be working in humanities computing and get away from all of those messy things like feminism, critical race studies," and I don't think he used the term queer studies. He may have said gay studies or something like that. Well, he didn't know exactly who he was talking to, and we were off to the races. But what he was voicing is a belief that has more and more fallen away, but that digital humanities is separate from and is objective and outside of the rest of our critical practices, etc. And that computing itself is going to always ignore race, gender, etc. So that's where the talk comes from, or part of it. And let me begin by saying that there has been something of a thaw of late. FemTechNet has been going strong for more than a year, and instead of MOOCs, the massive online open course software, which tends to be very top-down. I'm not anti-MOOC necessarily, but it does tend to be very top-down. It puts the professor in a position of authority and tends to ignore many of the practices in which we've been engaged for the last 25 or 30 years. Instead of that, FemTechNet has been working on a DOCC, D-O-C-C, which is Distributed Online Collaborative Course. And it institutes some key principles of feminist pedagogies that rest on a foundation of learner-centered instruction. Publication after publication, if you pick up the Chronicle almost any day, you will see that there's a call in all of our academic journals for learning communities, service learning projects, community learning initiatives, diversity education, education in transnational thinking, and curricula that incorporate collaborative assignments and projects, each and all of which feminist scholar teachers have been developing for decades. So that's one sign of the thaw. Another sign of the thaw are some new numbers of meaning new issues of some prominent journals. One is ADA, a journal of gender, new media, and technology. And ADA is named after, do you know who it's named after? You know? Ada Lovelace, yeah. Who is talked about as the first computer programmer. She's Byron's daughter, by the way. So, and that brings together ongoing conversations in critical race theory, woman of color feminisms, queer studies, new media studies, and the digital humanities. And they insist on moving beyond the black-white binary, but also acknowledging that that's one binary that is still often with us. And it's a very interesting, fascinating issue. Another interesting journal issue is the spring issue of Differences. And it was titled In the Shadow of Digital Humanities, and featured some of the key debates going on in digital humanities about diversity and intellectual advancement, and whether digital humanities has paid as much attention to diversity as it could. There's some gatekeeping in this issue that, and it takes the form of defining what digital humanities is and is not. And digital humanities are many, many things. You can't define digital humanities as one thing. And there's a very trenchant analysis by Adeline Coe of the politics of niceness and of civility, which I'm always talking about, you know, it's very important. I quote Henry James, 3 things in life are important. The first thing is to be kind. The second thing is to be kind. And you can tell me the third thing, right? It's to be kind. So niceness is very important and civility is very important, but they can sometimes serve as a mask for a kind of gatekeeping and a kind of maintaining a secretive politics of exclusion. So, So yes, there's been something of a thaw, though not so much with the major funding agencies, although that's happening a little bit too, which fund computational tools, but not sociological ones. So here's the first slide. The degree to which American society has embraced and absorbed computer technology is astonishing. The degree to which the changes provoked by computers leave prevailing inequalities is troubling. And I don't know if you're sitting there guessing when this might have been said or published, but a lot of audiences, when I have pointed to this quotation, have said, oh, it must be last year, or maybe, year before, something like that. And it's from Signs from 1990. So that's pre-World Wide Web, I'll point out. And another thing that's important to remember is that in the wake of the 60s, the humanities in general and their standings in particular had suffered, according to some, not everybody, from being feminized by the messy considerations that my host at Oxford was talking about: gender, race, sexuality, class, and humanities computing, especially when coupled with scholarly editing, seem to offer a space free from all of that messiness. So, here are some of my questions to you. I don't know if you can see these, but in what ways might digital humanities and new media be responsible to and for cultural, social, and intellectual work? At a time when feminist, critical race, sexuality, and class critical inquiries have had such a profound effect, and for decades in the humanities, the configuration of mainstream NEH-funded digital humanities are often similar to the politics of exclusion and occlusion, which we have worked so long to transform. And that is still so much the case that I had a very prominent young feminist scholar ask me, and who works in queer studies, asked me in the spring, must we build our worlds in the digital margins? And I will be frank and say I've been very fortunate in some of my grant getting, because I work on Emily Dickinson. And she's very, very, as you know, mainstream. So, what are the consequences of such frozen social orders when they are made to seem as if they're objective features of intellectual life? That's one question with which I'd like to begin, but I of course want to go on and ask, what can we do? What are some of the ways in which we might transform the digital humanities? And there's a Transform DH hashtag that's very, very active now and very important. So what can we do to transform the digital humanities so that our innovations are sociological and not only technical? Many, many tools have been built over the past 15 years that no one uses. Some get used, some don't. But a lot of money has been spent, so how can we build things that will be used and will be accessed? A very real function of the humanities, I find myself often reminding myself, and even arguably our primary one, is to engage in the act of creativity, moment by moment, to improve the quality of life in the world we live in. And I hope you'll forgive me in a few minutes when I ground some of these critical observations by looking at several digital Dickinsons, or by at least pointing to them and telling you about them. And in the question answer period, if you want to, we can look at some of them. Okay. So in what ways might digital humanities and new media be responsible for and to cultural, social, and intellectual work? Can feminist criticism and theory, critical race studies, sexuality studies, and class studies advance and otherwise improve the work of computer science, information studies, library science, humanities computing, digital humanities, scholarly editing? And many of my examples today are going to focus a lot on the scholarly editing component, which for me has been tied up with the digital for 20 years now. What are the responsibilities of cultural criticism in this brave new world of the digital scholarly edition, the digital scholarly resource? All right, so perhaps a flash history of digital humanities might be in order. And I mean, this is a basic flash history, all right? Access and scale was emphasized in the early years. Look at what we can do. And that was, of course, the results of PCs and the World Wide Web and being able to connect. You know, we now take this for granted, and it's so taken for granted that, I don't know, we don't even see it anymore. But that's one of the things we were like, okay, look at what we can do. Then, a fantasy of completeness and of comprehensivity. This was one of the first fantasies that I and many others engaged in. We're going to get all of the Emily Dickinson together, and it's going to be in one resource. But notice I'm calling this a fantasy. And the fantasy is about materials gathered and also in the ability to connect them in some kind of not over-mediated way. So that was another fantasy that we had early on. And then we had a fantasy about transparency, showing but not necessarily telling about omissions. And as an English or American literary poetry scholar, I of course can't resist quoting Marianne Moore. Omissions are not accidents. And they never are accidents. So, I want to share with you something a friend of mine said, and this is 7 years ago. And I don't ordinarily read slides, but I think it's important to read some of these things out loud while you can read them right up there. When the system of scholarly communications was dependent on the physical movement of information goods, we did business in an era of information scarcity. As we become dependent on the digital movement of information goods, we find ourselves entering an era of information abundance. In the process, we are witnessing a radical shift, and notice I've bolded this, in how we establish authority, significance, and even scholarly validity. That has major implications for the humanities and the social sciences in particular. I would say, too, that there There are marked changes in the way we produce, share, move, store information, and that all of that does have implications for authority and scholarly validity. But the question I'm asking today is, are we seeing the radical shift that Jensen has imagined here? In some quarters, such as those that I talked about earlier, gave as examples, we have seen signs of a thaw, and I'm very pleased that the institute I started, Myth, is actually starting a collaborative, or they've been working on a collaborative TEI project where they're really collaborating. It's not one person's markup schema, and that's terrific. But how have the old orders been inflected by new media for knowledge exchange, really? How have they? Who is willing to question those old orders, and who clings to them? And now I'll just say that questions that are really basic to the kind of diversity scholarship that I've named are certainly worth asking of our digital work. And they're these kinds of questions. How do items of knowledge, organizations, and working groups come into being? Some working groups are statusy, and some are not. And how does that influence both what's produced and how what's produced is received? Who made our items of knowledge, and for what purposes were they made? Whose work is visible? What is happening when only certain actors and associated achievements come into public view? And I'll go back to a question that was embedded in something I said earlier, which is what happens when social order is assumed to be an objective feature of social life? And what happens when those social orders are uninformed by ethnomethodology, which is always reminding us that social order itself is illusory. It's something that we have produced. And Lucy Suckman, who is a feminist sociology, what happens when one recognizes that social structures appear to be orderly, but are in reality potentially chaotic. And don't worry, I'm going to show you a few examples that I hope will make some of this more clear. So, let me remind you of some things that are so obvious we take them for granted. The politics of ordering within binary divisions, subject and object, human and non-human, nature and culture, and the one we forget about most, I think, is old and new. The politics of technology. Where is agency located, and whose agencies matter? In the digital archives I've either produced or advised, who are the real active agents in those? And are they coerced or not? And then another question, what counts as innovation? Why are tools valorized, whether they be new digital tools or editorial tools such as variorums? And reflecting upon scholarly production, digital production, what happens when we ask questions such as whether the mundane forms of inventive yet taken for granted labor are necessary? And there I'm thinking of what's invisible, but we try to make visible in, say, the Dickinson Electronic Archives, are the many people who work on it, from undergraduates all the way up to senior scholars such as myself. And that is true not only of our project, but of every single project on which I've ever worked. And innovation needs to be sociological as well as technological. All right. So you're probably sitting there saying, well, okay, whatever. I mean, this sounds fine, but where is, she keeps saying about examples, what's she going to tell us? So, I said at the outset that I would ground some of my examples in digital Dickinsons. And notice I'm saying digital Dickinsons. There are many. The function of scholarly editing is in large part to preserve the human record as responsibly as possible. Yet how responsibly is defined and by whom are crucial questions to ask. In 2014, there are multiple scholarly digital projects underway on Emily Dickinson, contributing to what I hope will become a Dickinson Commons online. Since she championed dwelling in possibility, this is, I would argue, undoubtedly a very, very good thing. Dickinson is, after all, a subject and a curator of our deep gossip and of our archives. Archives of documents and artifacts in the special collections of prestigious libraries and in the Dickinson houses known as the Emily Dickinson Museum, virtual archives such as those at the Dickinson Electronic Archives, Emily Dickinson's correspondences, a born digital textual inquiry, radical scatters, Amherst College Digital Collections Emily Dickinson Collection, the Emily Dickinson Archive, which is produced by the Houghton Library and Harvard University Press, and you mentioned, Bill, when you were introducing me, Houghton Library Emily Dickinson Collection, the Emily Dickinson Paper Boston Public Library, and the Emily Dickinson Museum. So those are, what, 8 very high quality scholarly digital Dickinsons. And when I first started out, I would have wanted to gather all of those into one resource, and I've changed my mind. I think this is a really good thing. And you can ask me more about that if I don't explain it enough. And I'll also remind you that there are the archives of our intellectual, emotional, and even spiritual attentions. No single archive or edition, digital, physical, or bibliographic, can claim to be the most authoritative, and certainly no one archive can claim to be definitive. And this, too, is a very welcome fact of the matter, at least as far as most involved with the various projects I'm associated with and with these are concerned. In digital humanities and in the Thaw, we are beginning to see a mandated change has begun to emerge, from emphasis on tools to users. And so you get the transform DH. And collaborative knowledge production. I have seen this in my own work on the digital scholarly edition, Emily Dickinson's Correspondences, a born digital textual inquiry, and in the evolutions of the Dickinson Electronic Archives 2.0, which is one of 2 oldest digital Dickinson projects. The other one is Radical Scatters, and that's why those 2 are at the top. These are in chronological order of production. Dickinson Electronic Archives, 1994 to the present. Radical Scatters, 1998 to the present. Emily Dickinson's Correspondences, 2008 to the present. Amherst College Digital Collections is 2011. Emily Dickinson Archive is 2013. Houghton Library Emily Dickinson Collection was recast in 2013 as well. The Boston Public Library and the Emily Dickinson, so they're in chronological order, roughly. Issues of authority, authoritative, and authoritarian. Issues of access, mediation, and remediation, and issues of visibility and exclusion are constant concerns and opportunities. And I repeatedly raised those about my own project and about the Harvard Emily Dickinson Archive, the advisory board on which I sit. And I was not alone on that advisory board. We were divided, actually, in raising those questions. Some on the board did not want to ask them. And currently, the Emily Dickinson Archive, which is splendid, it's wonderful. But what it is, it's a foundational text are Harvard University Press's Ralph Franklin's Variorum, not Emily Dickinson's manuscripts. And it features no editorial innovation and little innovation as a digital archive. And I've said everything as an advisor that I'm saying to you. So I'm not saying anything about Harvard that I haven't sat in a room and said many, many times. So it's framed, I would argue, and I'm just using it as the example. Oh, here are some digital Dickinson pictures that I should have been scrolling through. These are evolutions of radical scatters in the Dickinson Electronic Archives. In this, they came together, the Dickinson Electronic Archives and radical scatters. And this is an exhibit we have going on now in which very few people want to participate because I think they're kind of scared, that is about interrogating an archive and what it is. And you can see we've got the Harvard project, the Dickinson Archive, our exhibition and virtual conference, and the Amherst College digital collection. So here is how I would say something that's relatively static, like the Harvard resource, is framed. It's using old paradigms, or what I would call frozen social relations. An author's work is best when presented in a single, most authoritative scholarly edition. It's been vetted. Scholarly editions subsequent to such an edition are corrections, and they supplant what has come before. Editors working on a single edition probably agree with each other. And I don't know if you've co-edited anything, but I have yet to co-edit a project where we all agree with each other. And certainly if they don't agree with each other, in any disagreement, one party is right and all the others are wrong, or at least one party is better than all the others. And this last is probably the most important thing. Readers and users of such editions need not be bothered with the details of judgment that went into determining what to include, exclude, and in what order. So I would argue that really we need some new paradigms. That an author's work, and I've argued this before, it doesn't need to be normalized. Someone like Dickinson, it doesn't really need to be normalized. And diverging views of its identity should not be excised. It's fine that there are diverging views. That multiple authorities, including users, can be included for scholars and students of all levels to process and analyze rather than a single authoritarian view. New paradigms, scholarly editions produced over time. They're not corrections, but they're genealogical markers of what we could see and understand at a particular time. Editors don't need to agree with each other. Even in a print edition I did, we tried to seal into the print and share differences that we had over what should be included and what shouldn't. My co-editor didn't want to include Emily Dickinson's joke about flatulence, for example. And so we wrote about that in the notes. We included it, by the way. Users of such editions, I think, can really benefit from seeing intellectual disagreements and editorial disagreements and what went into determining what was worthwhile to include and what can contribute to the decision-making process. So, I'm going to share with you one of the things I've argued for that's been implicit is collaboration. It's very important for us to be collaborating with one another, with other editors, that the single editor I don't necessarily think is a good thing. This is not Emily Dickinson. This is her sister-in-law, Susan Dickinson. And I started working on her poems. This is a draft poem. And this is an example of a scholar knowing too much and therefore making a huge mistake. I had written an article on Susan Dickinson that was in a volume that was reviewed in the London Review of Books, and my article was singled out for praise. So of course I thought I was pretty hot, I loved that. And they said, oh, Professor Smith, that's just wonderful that she knows. I happen to know that Susan Dickinson's favorite painting that she and her husband collected in their house was John Kensett's Sunset with Cows. And so knowing that, I looked at this and I transcribed this as I'm waiting, but the cow's not back. I fondly call, and I, went on. And I said, this is an ekphrastic poem responding to John Kensett's painting. Now, the poem ends with, I know she will come with outstretched hands. And I started editing with one of my graduate students, who's now a tenured professor at the University of North Carolina. And she said, Martha, she said, it just bothers me that the poem ends with, I know she'll come with outstretched hands. I mean, a cow doesn't have hands. And I would say, oh, Laura, it's poetic license. Forget about it. Forget about it. So, I had started Myth. I'm sitting at my computer. At that time, I had my email set so a little bell would go off, when emails come in. And email comes in. I look to see what it is. It's a message from Laura. And we've been having this argument for months. And I kept assuring her that she didn't know what she was talking about. And I had made her make her own alphabet of Susan Dickinson's handwriting, because I said, if you look at mine, that's not going to be good, because the way I see her letters is going to corrupt what you see. It's going to influence. So she had done that very studiously, and she said, and she was very smart. She knew what to do. She said, on the verso of this poem we've been talking about is Susan Dickinson's outline for her book of Emily. And you're the one who has dated this poem, and you've dated it correctly. It is several months after Emily Dickinson dies. So I thought, okay, I'm reading through this email and I'm thinking, all right, she's leading up to something. And oh, by the way, the subject line of the email, and I was born in Texas, all right, is Houston, we have a problem. And so I read through the email, and she gives that all the big, build up, and she says, I don't think it's I'm waiting, but the cow's not back. I think, and remember she told me, you're the one who's got the outline for the poem, blah, 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 on the back. I'm waiting, but she comes not back. It's written in the fall. Emily Dickinson and Susan Dickinson's favorite time of the year was autumn. And Susan, this is a poem about missing her very dear friend. I read through Laura's outline or email, and I looked at this and I said, you know what, she's right, I'm wrong. And so I wrote about it and published an article in American Literature about the importance of collaboration and about not being frozen in your own social relation to what you've said before or you've thought before. It's okay for things to evolve and to change. So, collaboration, very important. Scientists know this. Next one, the advantage of many more pairs of eyes on the same evidence. The advantage of different levels of expertise. I've actually learned a lot. One of the great things about the going on the World Wide Web is that you have all of these novice users and all of these people who say they don't know anything about Emily Dickinson. They've taught me a lot about reading her because they ask questions and make speculations they were not trained not to ask. And it's fantastic. Great knowledge can create great misleading misconceptions. Now, I wouldn't call my knowledge great, but that's my little tiny example I shared with you of how I had a misconception about what I was seeing. And fresher views, they don't have to unlearn that which restricts what they see. So I've long been arguing, probably for the past 15 years, that the most important technology we have is self-consciousness. And I don't mean the kind of self-consciousness where you look in the mirror and say, is that a pimple I have at the age of whatever? But, you know, it's a self-consciousness about what we're doing and how we're doing it, about who has stakes in what we're doing and what are our stakes in what we're doing. Our users should be producers, not simply consumers. We should always acknowledge we live in a read-write world. Always question what authority means, what expertise means, how you organize labor. I think all of us must excel in the use and manipulation of images, and what I mean is we need to be able to look to see what's being presented to us on an image and say, okay, there could have been things done to that, and always put human creativity at the center of the humanities, at the center of productions of authority. Now, these suggestions all come from methods generated by the other area in which I was trained that I've mentioned several times: feminist criticism and theory, critical race studies, queer theory, and class studies. And they've all advanced my work in scholarly editing and in scholarly study of poetry. And I contend that they can also improve the work of digital humanities. And you know from Transform DH, I'm not alone in this. I've come a long way since that banquet at Oxford, where I was, by the way, one of 2 women invited to this conference. And there were no people of color, none, at this thing. And I think all of our work, whether we be digital humanities, scholarly editing, computer science, information studies, library science, can benefit from this. And that the frozen social relations of old orders can and should be thawed in order to enable sociological innovations and thereby advance our world. I'm going to show you one last example, because I realize you've been sitting here for a while, and you may be thinking, okay, she's told us how things might be, say, with the Harvard archive. But the one last example is one that one of my collaborators have talked about for a long time. This manuscript is at Harvard. It reads, can you read Emily Dickinson's handwriting? Morning might come by accident, sister. Night comes by event. To believe the final line of the card would foreclose faith. Faith is doubt. Sister, show me eternity, and I will show you memory, both in one package lane and lifted back again. Be Sue while I am Emily. Be next what you have ever been, infinity. No one ever wrote me a poem or whatever like that. This is in the Emily Dickinson archive, and you would probably think that if you search for Morning Might Come by Accident, you would find it, right? You won't. If you search for Morning Might Come by Accident, you won't find this poem in the Emily Dickinson archive, but it's there. Now, why? It's because that archive, its foundational text, are not Emily Dickinson's manuscripts, even though there are many manuscripts featured there. The foundational text that are marked up, and this is fine. I wouldn't do it this way, but it's not my resource. I'm just an advisor. Is Ralph Franklin's wonderful Variorum published in 1998. That's what's marked up, not the manuscripts. And so that's what dictates all of the searchability in that archive. And if you search for show me eternity and I will find you show you memory, you will find this manuscript. Because Franklin marked show me eternity and I will show you memory. That part is a poem. The rest is not. Now, a different lecture and a different class is the textual geographies of that and how would you divide between poetry and prose, and is there any division there between poetry and prose, and how would you argue for it if you see one? So, my closing remarks, I've already said the technology of self-consciousness should always guide our practices so that we're asking about legitimating authorities, why they're invoked, and the principles of selections of artifacts obscured or curated to reveal only so much. And some of this happens accidentally, by the way. If so, users need to work to lift the veil, shrouding the record keeping and thereby determining what remainders are worthy to keep and study. And in that, I'm alluding to the fact that archives are never comprehensive bodies, they're remainders. And their arrangements are that. Makers of digital resources need not, as some containment theorists would have us believe, succumb to the persistence of containment. And here I would suggest we engage in what Jonathan Dollimore has called transgressive reinscription, and that is a very important strategy. Makers of digital resources need to be explicit about who is producing the resource and for what purposes. Again, how have the items of knowledge and the organizations and working groups who made them come into being? Who has stakes in their presentation? What is visible in the new media archives and what might not be? Can what is invisible but relevant be known to users of digital archives and digital resources? That speaks to transparency or not. Producers should make every effort to make clear what has been occluded by remediation. And that's hard to do, but we really need to work to do that. By principles and practices of selection, and to unfreeze all of those very old binaries of authority and involve users in knowledge production, which is happening in some areas and not happening in others. Whose work is visible and what is happening, again, when only certain actors come into public view. Innovation continues to be a very hot term, especially in the digital world. And what counts as innovations should be persistently and self-consciously repeated over and over and over again and asked. The frozen social relations of old orders can and should be thawed. There is hope, there are opportunities to crawl out, or to climb out, as I like to say, rather than crawl, out of the old containments. And we should dwell in those possibilities and practice transgressive reinscription in our scholarly archives. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions. If you have a question, if you could use the microphone, because we're recording this, and so it'll get picked up on the recording.
I wonder if you, thank you for that, that was wonderful. I'm Peter Whitehouse, I'm a geriatric neurologist. I'm interested in the neurohumanities.
Yes, you told me that before,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I wonder if you see any parallels between the kind of objectification that might be offered by either digitization or making things related to the brain, and whether that represents, in some sense, both a similar challenge and opportunity to the humanities.
Well, I would ask someone like you who works more, although one of my friends at the University of Maryland, with whom I've worked very closely, is a neuroscientist. And she and I talk all of the time about the opportunities for a kind of, that objectivity can sometimes shift. Would you agree with that? I don't know. She talks about that. And that standpoints, et cetera, really make a difference. I mean, do you see opportunities for some of this?
Yes, I think the perspective can change. I mean, I'm, I guess, a critic of thinking that either having a computer or a human brain somehow brings to the conversation something that is more real, more objective, and therefore something like neuropolitics or neuroeconomy or I mean, the phenomena that we're talking about is neuroculture, that you put the word neuro in front of everything and suddenly enhance its credibility. But I think it's overdone. I think there's a danger, personally.
Yes, I see what you're asking now. I sort of misunderstood. Yeah, there is a danger in, and you know, I think we all need to be very nimble and agile, be fluid in the way that we're thinking about things, not be afraid, not embrace change just because it's change, but also not be afraid of it. And one of my greatest joys is working with Avis and thinking through some of these things. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but.
Yes, it begins to, it was helpful, let me put it that way, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming today. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you, Allison.
So one of my questions that I do work on media studies, and one of the things I'm often a proponent of is really exposing the infrastructure and the backside phenomena, right?
Yep.
Because what you're interfacing with has political, material, ecological consequence, right? So we need to kind of know.
Right.
How does the information get to me? So I'm really interested in what you're saying about scholarly production and saying, okay, who produced this and when and why and what's excluded? But I'm also really interested in the increasingly in far left-wing politics, you see anonymous collectives producing scholarly work, and I'm thinking particularly of an Uncertain Commons.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and that's a very different, they embed in their work conflict within the commons, but they don't name specifically their members. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that approach to scholarly productions as a means by which to also seek to thaw frozen social relations.
Right. I mean, if I can call it this, the politics of anonymity is at least a double-edged thing. You know, it can be a really good in that it can protect people who don't have much power and that kind of thing. That part of it can be good. It can also be a way that people who have power inhabit a position and don't take responsibility for it. And so one of the things that I said, you know, how is responsibly defined? And so I would say that in something like that, those who have a little bit more leverage and a little bit more power, I think they're responsible for saying, this is who I am, and this is who I'm speaking from. I don't know if you agree with that. But I do understand that those who could suffer because they are in a weaker position, a not as statusy position or whatever. I understand why they want to be anonymous. By the way, whenever I review things for presses, I always tell the editor, you can tell the author or authors who I am. I have no investment in, and that actually goes back to a long time ago when I was an assistant professor, being accused by somebody whose manuscript I didn't review, of reviewing her and causing for her manuscript to be rejected. And then she continued to say, that Martha L. Smith, she reviews for every press and they're always rejecting my manuscript. And I was like, I've never reviewed your work. So I went to one of my senior advisors and she said, unless you're embarrassed, and I said, no, I'm not. I'm happy. So I always reveal myself. I do understand why some people don't want to, but when it's to access power without responsibility, I do not support anonymity then.
Thank you.
If you're vulnerable, yeah.
We have time for one more question.
I have one, but I don't want to walk through. Can I just shout it, or?
No, you have to walk to the mic.
Only for you, Martha.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, you too. So my question is maybe is another binary that might constrain this sort of freeing Xanadu of the digital humanities 2.0 copyright. What do you just, I don't have a question, but what do you think, because when you step away from official digital humanities, you have all this kind of fertile, wild ground where people are saying and posting, whatever they want. But here, you don't always have that luxury.
Right.
Is that a problem that sometimes in a digital humanities platform, you can't always show what you want to show?
Oh, yeah. I mean, what year is this, 2014? We, about almost 10 years ago, we completed markup of all of Dickinson's materials. And they were going to be included in the digital scholarly edition Emily Dickinson, Correspondences of Born Digital Textual Inquiry. And the Chronicle had an article on it, so once again, I just, was so full of myself. But Harvard said, oh, no, 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 no. And the University of Virginia was willing to get into they were willing to sue Harvard or have Harvard sue them. But I said, you know what, I don't want to, you guys can do that, but I don't want to spend my life doing that. And I think eventually Harvard, by the way, like my pals on the Whitman archive, they can put things up because the Whitman is out in the public domain. You would think that Emily Dickinson, a 19th century writer, and legally she is in the public domain, but Harvard still claims that if you're quoting any Dickinson text and not transcribing it yourself, and now they've evidently trying to put a stop to that, but I've never paid to quote Emily Dickinson, period. I understand that all of my fellow scholars, or many of my fellow scholars, pay $3.50 per line, $4.50 per line, whatever it is. And that's because I never quote the Harvard editions. I refer to them. I think they're wonderful. I have nothing, but I'm not quoting from them. I'm quoting from my transcriptions. Now that was a meandering, but you were asking about copyright. Copyright can be a problem, and it's kind of interesting to see what's happened with the way people use and remix films. In 2006, that was copyright was a huge problem, ownership, and now it seems like the film industry is kind of, I don't know if they've backed off or what, but that landscape seems to have changed dramatically. And I think that for many, including for Harvard and their attitude around Dickinson, that Amherst College digital collection, by the way, is very clear at the bottom that there's no legal standing for trying to make somebody pay for quoting. And so that's a huge difference between Amherst and Harvard.
Martha Nelson, thank you very much.
Thank you.